the only kind of identity that can create that kind of positive motivation for obeying God is an identity based not on your performance, where your performance and your obedience is actually getting God to making him owe you, when you know that you're already blessed in every good thing in Jesus Christ. Then what's your motivation? I've had somebody say to me once, well, if a Christian really isn't afraid that he's going to go to hell, then what's his motivation for living a good life? If you're telling me that you wonder why, if all your fears go away, you'd have any motivation to live a good life, that means the only motivation you have for living a good life is fear. I got a better one. It's love. I believe only the gospel can actually put you in a position where you're loving God for himself alone. But how do you love God for himself? If you're saved by your good works, you're not doing it for God, you're doing it for yourself, to get into heaven. So he'll answer your prayers. The only way you love God for himself alone is if you suddenly realize, I'm already saved. I'm saved in Jesus Christ. And now, why do I want to obey God? I now want to obey God because I want to please him, because I want to honor him for what he's done for me. And you see, the motivation is radically changed. It starts off by God and Satan having a dialogue about Job. God says, have you seen my servant Job? There is none like him in all the earth. And Satan comes back twice. This happens twice. And he says, does Job serve God for nothing? No, he's not really serving you. He's serving himself because you give him so many good things. He's not really your servant. He doesn't really love you. He's in it for the blessings. And then what God allows is for Satan to bring a lot of suffering into Job's life. Then what you have are three friends that show up to try to lament with Job, but instead they come after Job and they accuse him of wrongdoing. They basically say God would not be letting these things happen unless you were a bad guy. Their basic argument is, if you are having a worse life than other people, that must mean that you are a worse person than other people. Because good people have good lives and bad people have bad lives. And that was their argument. Job goes back and forth with these three guys, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And there are chapter and chapter of cycles in which one person speaks, Job responds, the second person speaks, Job responds, and so on. And that goes on all the way to chapter 31. In chapter 32 to 37, the truth starts to come out when a young man named Elihu shows up and speaks and critiques both Job and the friends. And finally, chapter 38 to 42, God shows up in a whirlwind. He speaks the truth. And in chapter 42, he actually restores Job's health, and he restores his wealth, and he restores his family. Now, how does this actually move the biblical storyline along? Here's something I think is rather subtle. There are 2 or 3 books, like especially I just mentioned Job and Ecclesiastes, that are a necessary balance to books like Proverbs. Because when you ask the question, how does sin actually affect us? How badly does it destroy our world? If you read just the book of Proverbs, it sounds like it's saying, if you obey, then good things happen. So the book of Proverbs will say, if you work hard, you will probably prosper. If you love your family, you will probably have a loving family. So, the book of Proverbs actually is constantly saying, if you do this, these good things will happen. If you do these good things will happen. And if you read the book of Proverbs, you might get the impression that Job's friends are right. The book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes both show us that suffering can happen to innocent people, or at least unfair suffering. Both the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Job say you can get out there and do everything right, or pretty much right. But the fact is that suffering is not distributed the way you might think. It's not just that if you live a good life, good things will happen, and if you live a bad life, bad things will happen. That's really just not the case. Both Ecclesiastes and Job say that sin has broken the world so much, and therefore there really is unfair suffering. There really is actually innocent suffering. That's one of the themes. But the second theme of the book of Job, which I think is extraordinarily important, is that you have to love God for himself alone. That's what Satan is saying to God is not true of Job. What Satan says is, Job doesn't really love you. He loves himself, and he's just using you. What's happening in the book of Job is that you'll see, to some degree, Satan's right. Because at a certain point, Job gets really close to saying, I've been a really good guy, and what good has it been? But he never goes there. You can read the book of Job, and a lot of times Job says some pretty nasty things to God. He said, I cursed the day I was born, and you're being unfair, and why are you doing all this? And at the end of the book of Job, God shows up and vindicates Job and tells his friends, you're wrong and Job is right. And you look back and you say, why is he being vindicated? Job sounds like many times he practically lost it. And he doesn't always sound all that kind and loving and respectful to God. But you're forgetting something. Job isn't just talking to the air, he's praying. He's talking to God. He's complaining about God, but he's talking to God about it. And that's actually how you ought to handle your suffering. On the one hand, you do not walk away as if you know better than God about how things ought to be going in the world. But on the other hand, you have every right to question. You have every right to pour out your misery. You don't sit there and say, oh, I don't want to complain because I just want to trust God. I'm sure he's working all things together. No, the book of Job promises and shows that God understands how we talk when we're desperate. That's why he shows up at the very end and says, I'm vindicating my servant Job. Because even though he expressed his grief, he stayed with God. And that's what you do. Don't walk away from God, but at the same time, don't try to hide your feelings or deny your feelings, cry. And if you do that, eventually, here's what's interesting. Job, in the end, shows that Satan's a liar, that God can bring us to the place where we love him for himself alone. Isn't that great? So the biblical storyline is, it teaches us something about the fall. The biblical storyline is creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And it teaches us something about the nature of what it means that we have fallen and that the created order is broken. That does mean that there can be innocent suffering. And you could be suffering unfairly. But it also tells us something about how you handle it. Lastly, how does this point us to Christ? Job was a relatively innocent sufferer. And because he was true to God in a pretty imperfect way, he brought about great good. What was the great good? Well, obviously, he was raised up at the end of his suffering and his family was restored. But it's also true that there have been hundreds of millions of people over the years who have learned from the book of Job and have been helped by the book of Job. Job's suffering, he didn't know why he was suffering. But what's fascinating here is that Job, because he relatively innocently suffered and relatively faithfully suffered, brought great good. But Jesus Christ is the true innocent sufferer, perfectly innocent, who is completely faithful to God, never questioned, and brought about infinite good. Infinite good. And that's the reason why, though Jesus' suffering doesn't completely eliminate our suffering now, it will eliminate it someday. We're going to live with him forever, and every tear will be wiped away.